Hi there. I had a chance to visit with my good friend Dr. Ryan Tinetti, who is a Lutheran pastor, Missouri Synod Lutheran pastor up in Arcadia, Michigan, on Lake Michigan. And he's written a book on preaching, not on sermon prep, but on preparing to preach. And you can find out more about it on his website. I think it's preachingfromtheheart.com is what he said. And anyway, he's very entertaining. His book is designed to help people preach effectively without using notes. It's a very interesting concept and one tied to an ancient tradition, and I just think it's fascinating. And Ryan's entertaining. He's a good friend, and so I hope you'll enjoy our visit as much as I had visiting with Ryan. Hey,
Hey, buddy.
can you hear me? I've got to turn your volume up. I can't hear you, man.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. How are you?
Probably about as good as you. Let's see. A pandemic wasn't enough to deal with.
Right. It's crazy. It's a crazy world. But how are things in your new lifestyle?
Yeah, no, it's great, and I got to give you a lot of credit for helping to encourage that. You and I had a really helpful conversation as I was, processing that call, and I think in some ways it affirmed some of my intuitions, but it was helpful to have somebody who actually knew what they were talking about and experience, to country life.
You found the one thing that I was capable of speaking intelligently on.
So be it. But it's been great. And I mean, even today, I posted this on Facebook earlier, but we, the family and I, school ended. And so we decided to camp last night, just out close by, just in some woods nearby. But my oldest, my 11-year-old, he decides to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go fishing, and he can do that. Actually, he's got several good fishing holes just within biking distance around here. And he and his buddies got up at dark 30 to go out, go fishing. His little brother came along later, and stuff like that. You can't beat it.
Oh yeah, no, that's. Well, how did he do? Did he pull it?
Yeah, he was fishing. He was not catching today.
So what do you fish for on Lake Michigan? It's Lake Michigan, right?
So you've got Lake Michigan. I mean, he wasn't fishing on Lake Michigan. Usually, if you want to fish on the big lake, you want to get into a boat and get out there. But we've got little lakes and streams and everything. But we've got everything. I mean, pike, trout, bass, and then salmon. So I mean, you name it.
We've got alligators.
Yeah. Fortunately, that's one of the selling points for Lake Michigan and life up here is we say Lake Michigan, it's the third coast, but it's unsalted and there's no sharks. So,
right. Well, you know what? That's a funny thing. When we had talked, I don't know, a year or so ago, whatever it was.
Yeah,
maybe it's been 2 years now or so. I wanted to take my family up to. You've got that summer camp there at your place, and I thought that would really be cool. Yeah. And then here we are, not traveling, staying at home, and I'm not kidding you, Ryan. I was going through my calendar, looking ahead, and going, okay, I'm going to go ahead and put it on my calendar for next year. So you can't accept a call anywhere else, at least until after 2021.
Excellent. Yeah, no, we won't be, and it would be awesome to for you guys to come up here. I mean, it's just so relaxing, and the lake is just it's beautiful. So we'd love to have you guys up here for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's considering it's expected to be 100 degrees today, 98% humidity. Lake Michigan action wouldn't be too bad.
Right. Yeah. Oh, God bless you. It's like what we were talking about the other day with, we're worshiping outside, and we can get away with that here this time of year, but in Texas, only if you want to kill your parishioners, I guess.
Right, exactly. So, okay. So really the reason I wanted us to talk and record this is you've got a really cool concept with the book that you said you told me the other day you just submitted the first draft of.
The manuscript has been submitted to the publisher, and so I've washed my hands of it.
So So it's a really cool concept, and one I'm interested in reading. I'll butcher it all, but tell me kind of the premise of what you've done.
Yeah, well, so for many pastors, if not most pastors, they feel a real sense of shame and frustration about the fact that they are not able to preach without notes. They recognize that, hey, when I'm preaching, whether it be from a manuscript or even from an outline sometimes, I'm losing that profound sense of connection that I have with my hearers, with the congregation. And I'm pretty much every preacher knows this. I mean, there's some who are real diehards and like, no, I want my manuscript there and I don't really care how it is. But for, I think, many preachers, they wish that they could preach without notes, but it's not really clear if you're going to do that. How would you do that? What would be a process? And when you look through your homiletics textbooks, all the standard works, they'll usually spend like 12 chapters on the content of the sermon, and then like half a chapter on delivery, and then like maybe a paragraph on, how to do it, whether you're going to deliver without notes or whatever. And it's really frustrating. And I just kind of stumbled across several years back this ancient technique from classical rhetoric called the method of loci, or the method of loci is the Latin word for places, and it's usually colloquially known as the memory palace. And this was how public speakers in the ancient world, of course, this is before everybody was writing everything out, right? It was an oral. What's that?
No teleprompters.
No teleprompters. And so one of the basic stages to preparing a speech was memoria, or memory. And it was, how could you learn your speech by heart so that you could deliver it without notes? And like I say, I just kind of happened upon this, and I started digging into it more and more, and looking around within preaching resources that were out there, and I did not see anybody talking about this. Now, since I've worked on it, I found out there's some old school preachers that knew about it. They learned about it when rhetoric was something that was more often taught in schools. Mm-hmm. But most guys have no idea. And if they are preaching without notes, it's many times because they're banging their head against the wall trying to to memorize their lines like they're a stage actor or something.
Right.
And what I try to show is that this time-tested ancient practice can help preachers not only to preach without notes, but what I call preaching by heart, where you really internalize the message so that you can deliver it, not just without notes, but so you can deliver it in the moment as a real spirit-prompted utterance to the people of God.
Yeah. Okay. So here's I've kind of come at this preaching stuff a little backwards. Early on, I didn't use much in the way of notes. And then I started putting a little bit more that, I might start with a really, really rough outline. Yeah. And then sometime later, I started, having a little bit more in my outline. And then right. I had more notes. And for the last several years, I've actually been manuscripting my sermons. And in part, that was so that I would have it written down so that I could look back and sometimes I have to remember, did I say that like 4 weeks ago? Because that was brilliant. I want to say that, but I think I might have already said it. So
nothing wrong with that.
And so I started and then I don't know if it's just become not a crutch, but it's there and I'd like to get back to preaching, and there's I think the only thing worse than having somebody read a manuscript, and by the way, I don't read my manuscript, but yeah. The only thing worse than reading a manuscript as preaching is memorizing the lines and preaching them that way. But there is the other thing that hurts me with my manuscript when I have my manuscript, because that's not the vein that I like to preach in. Yeah. I don't read from a manuscript, but I get lost in my manuscript more than once because I'm preaching along and I'm glancing at my manuscript and I've got and then I'm preaching from the heart, preaching, yeah. And then I'm like, okay, what's my next thought?
Right.
Man, I think that's
right.
And trying to get through it. So I'm anxious to read your book form and learn this technique better. Tell me about that technique.
Well, so you've said touched on some really important things there. So I want to back up a little bit because you mentioned how at the beginning you were preaching and it was more just kind of a freewheeling sort of thing. So you didn't have any notes, you were just letting it fly. And there's some guys that can really pull that off. And I think you're probably one of them. But even still, I contrast. So on the one hand, there's preaching, what I call preaching from the page. And that's where, you've just got that manuscript written out and you're really tied to it. You are tied to it like a baby to the umbilical cord, right? And you just need that. That is your source of life. And if you lose your place, like you say, it's disaster.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, it doesn't mean that the solution is what I call preaching from the hip. That, okay, I'm just going to, let's get up there and I'll just see what the Spirit moves in me. And actually there have been, and still are, some strains of Christianity that really advocated this, especially among the Quakers, but also some charismatic traditions. And they'll use as justification for that Jesus' words where he says, when you're pulled before the courts to testify, don't think beforehand what you're going to say because the Spirit will give you words. It's not clear from the context that he's talking about preachers on a weekly basis, not thinking about it and then just showing up and saying, hey, let's see what the Spirit has to say. So we're not aiming for preaching from the page, but neither from preaching from the hip, but instead, like I say, this preaching by heart. And I think the goal, manuscript, I want to be clear that the problem isn't a manuscript per se, especially insofar as, using a manuscript to really clarify your own thoughts as an exercise in your preparation. But what I talk about, and I got this from Tom Long, a great preaching scholar, is that in your preparations during the week, recognize that you are not preparing a sermon, but you are preparing to preach. And I think for many preachers, we get stuck in this rut where we think, okay, I've got to write a sermon. I've got to prepare a sermon. No. The people in your pews, what they receive is not what you happen to have written down. What they receive is what they hear on a Sunday morning. And so all those things, even if you happen to write out a full manuscript, don't view that as the sermon. It's all just part of your preparations to preach. See, it's a subtle difference, but I think it's a significant one.
Yeah.
And so for you, I wouldn't necessarily discourage you away from that manuscript, except to say, and not everybody's like this, but for me, and in the past when I was really in a manuscript kind of mode, I would turn into Gollum and I would treat it like my precious, like I spent all this time getting the sentences and the vocabulary just right. I don't want to lose that. And I do think that there's a place for really good turns of phrases and especially for really significant metaphors and narrative turns. But when we get into the weeds of the syntax and the sentence structure and all this kind of stuff, that's where we really hurt ourselves as preachers.
Right.
So if you're going to do a manuscript, you do it instead as an exercise.
And I think that's how I evolved to manuscript, to manuscripting it out, is because I would go along and I was trying to get more and more thoughts down, and I like this, I don't want to forget that. And then that just kind of grew to having somewhat of a manuscript. And my manuscript, if you looked at it, it's written very much like I speak.
Yes, exactly.
But I like the concept. And I want to hear more about the places.
Yes.
So explain that more to me.
Yeah. So again, it's called the method of Lochi, or the memory palace is easier to remember. So it's really brilliant, and it's so interesting to see how this ancient practice has really been verified by modern cognitive science. And what I mean by that is there's two big insights to it. The one big insight is that it leverages our spatial memory, which is to say our memory for places. And then the second one is that it exploits our predilection for pictures. The way that, as Aristotle put it, the soul always thinks with an image. We're always thinking in kind of concrete terms. That's what just naturally we do that. So the memory palace takes advantage of these two innate natural tendencies of humans. So the first piece of it is places and our spatial memory. And again, this is just like how, you and I as grown-ups, when our kids are small, we can really wow our kids when we just hop in the car and drive to grandma's house without thinking twice about this. I remember when I was a kid just being amazed by how is it that my parents have this recall to get to places. They're not looking at maps. Of course, nowadays it's all ruined because we got GPS.
Right.
But it's because our spatial memory, we're able to just recall places really, really well. And something I've found in myself even is that if I listen to an audiobook and I'm driving in a certain route, I can almost, connect which part of the book I was at to a particular place,
right.
Which is strange. Okay, but the first part of the memory palace is using places, using spaces as the background for the content of your speech or your sermon, as the case may be. So what the ancients would do is they would think about, what's a place I know really well? So just take your house, okay? So I think of my house, and it's got, say, 5 or 6 rooms on the main floor. And I kind of close my eyes, and in my mind's eye, I can picture it. Okay, I come into the foyer or the entry room, and then I go to the left, and I go over to the living room, and move back to the study, over to the kitchen, and so forth. So you would take that place, and you would allow that to be the backdrop. That's the step one. Step one is you identify a place that you know really, really well, because really the key here is if you don't know it well, sort of the whole process is pointless, because the idea is you're not going to be thinking about your place. You'll be able to mentally move through it as second nature, right? So using your home, using perhaps your church or your school, or even your neighborhood. It doesn't have to be indoors necessarily, but a place that you can picture in your mind's eye really, really well. And then the second step is you take the content of your message and just, the basic raw material of it, the points, the arguments that you're going to make. So even if you work from an outline, and it doesn't have to be like a super well-organized outline, but you've got it in basic, sections or movements, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got, okay, here's the first part of it, here's the second part. So what you do is you hook up, okay, here's the introduction to my sermon, right? Most sermons have some introduction. You take the content of that section and you associate those different points with pictures. So for example, say in my sermon this coming weekend, it's Trinity Sunday. This is my tradition. I don't know if you guys are doing Trinity Sunday as well, okay? Which is always one of the most difficult Sundays to preach on. But I'm going to start out, the title of my sermon is The End of the World, okay? And how right now it feels in so many ways like it's the end of the world. So in my introduction, I'm going to start out with that, right? And how it feels like it's the end of the world. We've got a health crisis, we've got a racial crisis, we've got economic crisis. So in my introduction, in my memory palace, I've got Michael Stipe, okay? And who's Michael Stipe? Michael Stipe is the lead singer from REM. And REM had this famous song, It's the End of the World, as we know. And so in my memory palace, I picture Michael Stipe, and he's in a hospital gown, and he's flipping over cars and coughing up blood. Why is he doing that? Because I'm going to talk about it's the end of the world, and there's these different crises, and so he's in the hospital gown because he's sick. He's flipping over cars like he's rioting, this sort of thing. And that also underscores, I think, an important point of the memory palace, which is that it's very personal, right? It's like it's super subjective. What to you associate, what's a picture that you associate with something. So the end of the world, to me, I go right to REM and Michael Stipe. But for you, it might be something different. Mm-hmm. So the idea is you take the content of the message, this the basic content. You're not trying to get word for word, but just kind of the core essential message for each section, and you're associating it with really vivid pictures. The more ridiculous, the more outrageous, even in fact the more lewd, classically they would say that. And that was part of, this is a whole nother issue, but why did the memory palace fall out of favor? Part of the reason is because the Puritans were so offended by the way that the memory palace was used, where people would have these really, like XXX images in their mind to help them memorize things. And they're like, we can't do that anymore. Now we've got a printing press, let's just stick to the script. But that's the idea, is you're creating outrageous pictures in your mind, associating it with the content of your message, and then just plopping it along your place and walking through.
Wow. Cool.
Right. Simple, right?
Yeah. That's it makes really good sense, but at the same time, I want more guidance in it. So I'm going to have to wait for your book. Because I'm hopeful, in applying this. So when you do this, when you work through it, you're intentional. How do you do it different now than say you did 3 years ago?
Sure.
Preparing your message.
Yeah. Well, this is really important. And you actually said something interesting earlier on when you said you kind of came at this backwards.
Somebody write that down. I said something interesting.
And this is part of how it has changed my approach, is you come at it backwards. So for many of us, we would, as preachers, we would spend a lot of our week, as I say, preparing a sermon. And almost like you were writing an essay, okay? Mm-hmm. And you do it all week, and then you get to say Saturday, and you would have to throw what I call the Saturday e-brake. Where like in those Fast and Furious movies, when they're driving really fast in one direction, and then all of a sudden they want to do a 180, and so they throw the e-brake or the emergency brake, and they do a quick spin around, and then they're going in the other direction. Preachers do this when it's like, okay, all week long I'm preparing like I'm writing an essay, and then come Saturday, it's like, oh crap, I'm going to actually have to preach this live and in person. And so I've got to figure out a way that I'm going to deliver this if I'm not just going to straight up read it from the page, right? So I throw the Saturday e-brake to try and do a 180 and get ready for that. But what the Memory Palace really encourages is instead start with the end in mind. In other words, start with the sense of, I'm going to be delivering this message. And so how can I, in my preparation, plan for that? Plan to be preaching this message and not just writing a sermon. And so in terms of the process, especially on the front end of the week, so just think of it in terms of like your preacher's week. And this is different for every guy and some and gal, and some will work further ahead than others. But just imagine it's Monday and you're preparing to preach on Sunday. That's the thing about Sundays. They just keep coming every single week. And so, Monday for me, I'm spending most of my time just studying. Right? Going through, reading the scriptures, reading the commentaries, getting into the original languages, this kind of stuff. And that's going to be the same, I think, for pretty much all of us. But then it starts to take a turn when I think through, and this is a classical practice of looking at the structure. How am I going to structure this message? So looking really intentionally at, do I want to structure this more in terms of a narrative? Do I want to structure it more in terms of what our teacher Will Willimon would call, in that Methodist vein, kind of three points in a poem, right? Or how am I going to structure this message? And then when I'm actually thinking about the content of it, I'm less thinking in terms of how can I write this, and more in terms of movements to the message. And in particular, insofar as the Memory Palace really encourages us to think in pictures, I'm going to be thinking in terms of concrete ideas and images, right? So rather than just what's kind of the abstract ideas that I can convey to the people, it's, okay, something like Trinity Sunday. All right, you can really get super abstract, highfalutin, and demonstrate, all your good preacher book learning. But it's not going to do any good because it's not going to connect with the hearers. So if I'm going to think in terms of concrete images, that's going to reward both in terms of my preparation to preach and for memorizing or learning it by heart. So that, okay, when I'm thinking of the Trinity, one ancient image that was used for the Trinity, so it was called perichoresis. The Greek word is perichoresis, right? The idea of a dance, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, almost like a round dance, right? Or square dance, round dance. Anyway, triangle dance. So I'm thinking more in terms of like these blocks of movements of the message that are more concrete, more vivid, rather than how can I just fill out 1,500 or 2,000 or 3,000 words for a message. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so starting with that end in view of what the delivery, how I'm going to be delivering this without notes by heart, it changes the way that I approach it all week long, so that I'm not just trying to write something out for its own sake, but I'm recognizing I'm going to deliver this. And so it changes the way I approach it.
So as you're going through that process, you're writing some stuff down.
Yeah.
Help you because if you're like me, you probably don't just sit down and, or even back when you did it like a normal preacher, you don't just sit down and go, okay, I'm about to knock out 15, 18 minutes worth of sermon here. You have some notes throughout the week and different things throughout the week. So you still kind of do that to tickle your memory and in where you are in your house.
Yes.
As you're building your presentation.
So like I say, I mean, a person can still write out a manuscript if that makes them more comfortable, just recognizing you do it as an exercise. What I advocate, an approach that I advocate though, is to sketch your sermon. And you can even think of this in kind of two senses. So you're sort of sketching it in the sense that you're not trying to write out a perfect masterpiece. You are trying to sketch out, to give kind of the broad brushes of the message, and really focusing on those key moments of gospel proclamation, those really core images that you're going to use, the metaphors and the analogies, and really focusing on that element of it, rather than trying to just get every last article and conjunction in there. You don't need to do that.
Right.
And I mean, really, like when you were talking about before, when you move away from your manuscript and you just start preaching, it's probably because you have an idea of, okay, in this movement, here's the big idea that I want to convey. Or you think of it like a journalist. What's like the lead that I want to get here, the who, what, where, when, why, and how, or and then the other things, you think of that as like a hook. Then the other stuff more naturally hangs off of that. Okay, so when I'm sketching the sermon out, I want to get the hooks in there, and I'll allow in the moment, or maybe I'll flesh this out a little bit more for myself, make some notes, what some of the further exposition is going to be, but I'm going to sketch it out. And I say that can be used in two senses, because for some people, if you're more of a visual kind of person, you might literally sketch it out, draw it out, almost like storyboard it. Because again, the memory palace lends itself more to this kind of visualization. And I can say more about that too, in terms of how you actually commit this to memory and learn it by heart. Visualization is a big part of it. But some guys, you might actually draw it out. Do your stick figures or this kind of thing. You remember it was sort of a big deal a few years back. I know you're a college football fan too. And when Chip Kelly was still at the University of Oregon, and one of the things that they were doing that everybody thought was just wacky is they would send in their plays, rather than the typical way that teams would send in their plays with all the goofy names, Red 92, whatever. They would have poster boards with pictures, right? They would have pictures of like sitcom characters or Disney cartoons or all kinds of random stuff. And I've wanted to look into that, what his MO was with that. But I'll be darned if it wasn't something akin to what we're doing with the Memory Palace, where I'm going to give you, here's just the basic images, right? Those pictures that are going to help you to recall. They're basically like fancy mnemonics, right? They're tricks to help you to jog your memory of what it was. And the pictures are a lot more effective than many other things.
Right.
And yeah.
Cool. Well, so I'm anxious to kind of work on doing it this way, and we'll start doing that. I'm in a weird spot right now in that we've been in the pandemic. We've been doing stuff from home.
Yeah.
Last week was our first week where we had some in-person worship. I like working ahead in my sermon prep and knowing where I'm going, and so usually I'm working well ahead. And I think that there's a way for me to do that and incorporate this in and maybe tell me if you think this works. As you were talking about the hooks, as I'm working ahead, at least setting those hooks as I go forward. So I've got a month's worth of hooks because I like to spend time working on stuff so that I'm looking ahead to the next week and the next week and the next week to kind of build things together. And so it might make really good sense if you're doing that future planning, that all those hooks even somewhat line up week to week as the lectionary. I typically go by the lectionary. I think you guys have a little bit different lectionary than we do, but same concept that a lot of the stuff does tie together throughout the season. And so
and so kind of along those lines, one trick that you start to find yourself able to do with the Memory Palace, we talk about you develop pictures to associate with the points in your message. Well, I find that I'll go back again and again to the same pictures, right? So I'll use, so if I'm, for instance, referencing a message from Peter in the Bible, I'll think of my brother, Peter, right? And so I'll always use him as my Peter guy, right? And you start to find some symbols or some images that really work for you, and then you can kind of have that continuity from week to week. But in terms of your point about working ahead, I think you're spot on, that you can kind of do, especially those initial stages of preparing the notes, maybe even structuring the message, sketching it out, getting those hooks out there. And then as you get closer to it, really working on your Memory Palace itself, which is to say, figuring out what's the place that I'm going to use for it. And for me, honestly, almost every single week, I just use my house. And I just keep going back to that well, because in the Middle Ages, the Memory Palace started to become a tool for people to commit to memory vast swaths of knowledge and information. And in fact, in more recent times, in the last 10, 20 years, it's experienced something of a resurgence, but not among public speakers or preachers, which is what it was natively, but among like med students and law students who have to memorize tons of information. And so they've been using the Memory Palace in order to memorize stuff for their tests or whatever. You can do that actually, but for preachers where it's like, okay, my goal is to basically put in the short-term memory bank, the content for a sermon. For me, I can just use basically the same place each week, and I sort of mentally wipe it. Mentally wipe it after Sunday, and start again, and then repopulate it with new pictures each week, right? But that process you could do as you get closer to the actual time, the Sunday that you're going to be preaching that message, and still be working ahead. So I think that they can go hand in hand that way.
So when you put it all together, when you put it all together, because currently I end up with a manuscript, and then usually Saturday evening or Sunday morning, or whenever I have a chance, sometime between Thursday and Sunday morning, I go through it a couple of times, generally out loud, usually whispering to myself, and I'm in the dining room whispering through it, and my wife will go, "Who are you talking to?" And but so I can hear it.
Yeah.
Yes. So do you go through a similar process of putting it all together and practicing?
Yes. Yeah, so this is again a real benefit with the Memory Palace, is that the preparation process, or rehearsal, if you will, looks a lot different. So for someone who's just trying to more or less rote memorize a manuscript or even an outline, it's a lot of just, what we say, like drill and kill, right? Like, I'm just going to keep going through this, keep going through this, keep going through this. And you can do that, but it's a pretty inelegant and kind of frustrating way to go about it. So let's just say you still have your manuscript and you're comfortable with that. You've been working from that. So how can somebody who uses a manuscript regularly start to incorporate elements of the memory palace so that they're able to better preach by heart? So what I would do is take your manuscript and first of all, break it up into the sections. Okay, so say you've got 4 or 5 parts to the message. Honestly, if you have more than 5 parts to it, it's too complicated. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to be able to learn it by heart because your people aren't going to be able to. Right. So simplify. Really almost every one of my sermons has 3, 4, or 5 parts. Mm-hmm. So first, break it into those parts. And then within each of those parts, break it into, again, 3, 4, 5 parts. Maybe those are the paragraphs. Okay. And for each one of those, conjure up a picture, a symbol, image to associate with it. Mm-hmm. Again, you're going through it. What's the big idea? What's the hook from this paragraph? Say, oh no, but it's all so important. Every one of those words, I bled on this page. I'm going to have every word in there. Friend, you are not. Okay, you don't need to do that. The way that the classical rhetoricians would put it is, you don't need a word for word. You need a thought for thought. Okay. Or a race for race, thing for thing, RES is the Latin word, a thing for thing kind of recovery of that. So go through each of those movements, break it into the paragraphs, maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs, and then for each of those into 3 or 4 pictures, okay? And then this is where you'll be kind of amazed to see how, if you are able to do that, and really, again, have these kind of ridiculous pictures, the more ridiculous, the better, how quickly it will come to you. And so you'll put it down. Maybe for you just kind of write it down, sketch it down. So here's what I have in each, or maybe it's just a matter of, okay, I'm going to look at this and think of it, kind of plot it in your head. But then it's in your head. Mm-hmm. And then it's kind of like, in my book, I talk about Michael Phelps. And Michael Phelps, his coach, whose name eludes me at the moment, would tell him as he was preparing, put in the videotape. And it's kind of a old-fashioned thing, videotapes. You remember these? Okay.
I remember.
Right. He didn't mean to literally put in a VHS into the VCR. What he's talking about is go to your place and visualize the movements of your swim, because you've done it so many times mentally. When he was actually standing on the platform, he would say, and there's even one race, I can't remember if it was in the Olympics or if it was just a trial or what, his goggles failed and it was filled with water. He literally could not see. He was blind, but he had mentally gone through in his own memory palace, so to speak. He never talks about it this way, but he could visualize it. He had done it so many times, he didn't even need to be able to see. So for preachers, once you have your memory palace developed and you think, okay, here's my message and here's my pictures, and I've kind of plotted those, say you do that on Thursday or Friday, between then and Sunday, you can have retraced and visualized that a dozen or more times by the time you get to Sunday. While you're driving in your car, while you're grocery shopping, you're just kind of mentally walking through, retracing those steps, so that by the time you get to Sunday, put in the videotape. You're just walking through. You've already done this so many times that you now have that kind of confidence. And I know we're running shy on time, but this is where the idea is when somebody says, "Oh, I've lost my place," like that goes back to the memory palace. Or in the first place, in the second place. Those are holdovers from the memory palace. Yeah. So that even if
you're telling me that it's not losing your place on the page, it's losing your place.
Exactly.
Ancient tradition of putting it together.
Yes, in the method of Lochi. And so when Pastor Powell, really gets going and he kind of really goes off script, so to speak, then he said, then you just have to remember, okay, now where was I? Right? Literally, in memory palace. And you retrace it. Oh, I was in the kitchen. That's right. And you go back there and you pick it up and you go on from there. Now, I don't want to give the impression that this doesn't take practice. It's a skill, and it's not the first time. It's not going to happen right away. But with some practice, I'm telling you, it just makes the practice of preaching so much more enjoyable, so much more liberating, and ultimately so much more beneficial for your people.
Well, like I said, I'm looking forward to, hopefully a lot of people pick. Do you have a name for the book yet? Is
Preaching by Heart. Yep. Preaching by Heart.
Okay.
And folks can look it up. The book's not out yet, but my website, www.preachingbyheart.com, and be blogging there and just sharing some other things on the art and craft of preaching.
Well, I think it's great. I did one of these Zooms with Will Williman, and talking about he wrote a book not too terribly long ago, Leading with the Sermon, and in that he talks about how that really is the most important thing that a pastor does. There's a lot of important things that a pastor does, but leading with the sermon and being able to preach well is probably the most important thing that a pastor does. And I think that you're contributing to our ability to preach well. And I appreciate that. And I'm hoping to, get as many of my clergy friends to jump on the bandwagon and buy your book, read it, figure it out. And ultimately what we want is everybody to be touched by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if we can improve the way we convey God's message, carry on, man.
Exactly. I mean, that's at the end of the day, it's how can we better connect God's word with God's people? And if my delivery is in some way inhibiting that, I want to work on that. I want to improve it. I'm there to be a messenger, and I'm not there to be a roadblock to the word of God. So absolutely, I hope that it'll be some help to you and to others, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap it up, but I got to say, I'm gonna have to find a lower class of friends or something. But these visits that I've been having with folks. I mean, people writing these books. Will and I talked with Craig Hill and the Bossinator, Michael Boss, Dorrell, and I have done one. He's got a great book. I'm hoping it's going to arrive today,
yes.
And so that I can read it. But
smart man, Wade, because you associate yourself with good company. See?
Well, there's that old saying, and it's supposed to, make you do. I just feel like a slacker, man.
I feel you, bro. No, but I really appreciate you doing these conversations. It's been super illuminating, and I'm honored to be able to contribute as well. So thank you for inviting me.
I appreciate it, and I'm glad to see you on Facebook now, man.
I'm not sure I'm glad to see me on there, but if it helps me to connect with my old buddy Wade, so be it.
There you go. And I don't know, at least a year from now, I will be seeing you. Okay.
Yes, I'm counting on it. Good.
All right. My love to your family.
Thank you. You too. Stay cool.
All right. See ya.